Hello and welcome to the True North podcast. I'm your host, Candace Malcolm. And on today's episode, I want to talk about a story that has resurfaced in the Canadian news this week. It's a story that made a lot of headlines a little over a year ago. It was a very curious and strange story. And as we are seeing with it being resurfaced in the news right now, there are still a lot of questions that remain unanswered. So I am talking about Federal Liberal Cabinet Minister Monsef. So as you may recall, it was last fall that the very strange revelation surfaced, and we learned that Monsef was not born in Afghanistan as she had claimed, but instead was born in the neighboring country of Iran. So why was this important? Well, Monsef had sort of built her career, her political career, and her identity on being an Afghan refugee. There were countless news stories celebrating her electoral victory in 2015, and heralding her as the first Afghan refugee to ever make it into the Canadian government and ever hold a cabinet position. When former US President Barack Obama visited Ottawa, he gave Monsef a specific mention and talked about how she had made the journey from Afghanistan to Canada and how proud the whole world was to see her achieve this very impressive status. So the problem, of course, is that so much of the story was untrue. So Monsef was sort of asked about it, and finally she admitted that she was born in Iran. She came up with a story. The story that she presented to the media was that her mother had simply lied to her. So her mother had led her to believe her entire life that she was born in Afghanistan. But it wasn't just where she was born. It wasn't just where she was born. She actually grew up most of her early life in Iran. So she originally said she was from Herat, Afghanistan. Turns out that she was actually from Mashhad, Iran, which is a couple hundred miles away. Mashhad is a upscale city. It's a nice part of the country. And so up until the age of 12, Monsef spent the majority of her life in Iran. She says that her ethnicity is still she's still Afghani. It's just that's just where she happened to have lived. So she said that she lived in an Afghan refugee community within Iran. We also learned that her age was different. She had previously said that she was born in 1985. Now she was saying that she was born in 1984. So those were sort of the initial questions that came up. And it was really interesting in Canada. The Canadian media just sort of accepted what she said. The story was just taken at complete face value. There was no skepticism, no follow-up questions, no sort of extra digging. I think I was probably the exception, because I just thought that so much of Monsef's story didn't add up. So back then, this is 14 months ago, I started writing and investigating. I was talking to people in Peterborough, which is the city that Monsef represents in Ontario. I was hearing from all sorts of people from the Iranian community, the Afghan community, people who were sort of giving me tips. I spoke with people who went to high school with Monsef, and it seemed pretty obvious to me that her story had been very inconsistent, and it wasn't simply just that her mother had misled her. I mean, I think that if you put on a skeptical eye and you looked at this situation and this scenario, being skeptical is sort of the obvious outcome, because it's just, again, so much of the story didn't add up. I also learned that Monsef would travel back to Iran, back to Afghanistan, after she had received her Canadian citizenship. Well, most refugees don't travel back to the country that they fled, especially given that there hasn't been a change of government in either Iran or Afghanistan. It's the same government that she would have fled specifically in Iran. In a news interview, she also said that her family was technically safe in Iran. So if she was born in Iran and she was living in Iran and her family was technically safe in Iran, and then for whatever reason the family decided to pick up and move to Canada, they should have done so as immigrants. They should have come through the immigration stream, applied to come that way. Instead, they bought a one-way ticket to Montreal. The family, which was Monsef's two sisters and her mother, her father had been killed. They arrived in Montreal and claimed refugee status. They claimed asylum. As you may know, anyone from anywhere in the world can land in Canada and ask the Canadian government for asylum, and the Canadian government, by our own rules and by our own laws, is required to give each and every individual a hearing to determine whether or not they are a bona fide refugee. So in the case of the Monsef family, well, their name was Monsef Zadeh back then. They've since changed their names. But in the case of the Monsef family, they applied. Presumably, the mother told Canadian officials the same story that Monsef had repeated, which is that the girls were born in Afghanistan, that they were coming from Afghanistan, and probably didn't mention Iran. So they received refugee status, and then that was a major part of the problem, was when this story came back up in the news. Monsef had to explain not only why her passport, or not only why her passport information was incorrect, but whether or not that incorrect information came also from her refugee application and her citizenship application. And so there was a sort of a chain reaction of things. The question I was curious about was how she was able to travel back to Afghanistan and Iran. She went, I believe it was 2012, 2013, 2014. She traveled back to those countries. Now, most Canadians can't go to Iran. After 2012, the Canadian government and the Iranian government severed all diplomatic ties. We closed the Iranian embassy in Ottawa, and it made it very, very difficult for Canadians to travel to Iran. There's no Iranian embassy in the United States either. So if you were a Canadian and you wanted to travel to Iran, you'd either have to go to Europe and go to an Iranian consulate there in order to get your passport, or you would have to go to the Pakistani consulate in the United States, the embassy, and try to get your passport there. It's not an easy process. Monsef's office eventually told me that it was actually an Afghan passport that Monsef was traveling on, and that she had received her Afghan passport through the Afghan embassy in Toronto, or consulate in Toronto, which again raises a bunch of questions about why a former Afghan refugee would go and get a new Afghan passport, how she was able to get a passport from Afghanistan if she was actually from Iran. There's just sort of endless questions. So let's fast forward to today, 2017. And the reason that Monsef's back in the news is because we're learning that she still hasn't resolved this issue. It's been 14 months, and she still doesn't have an updated passport. She doesn't have an accurate passport, and she's been unable to fix this issue. And so that sort of takes us to a whole number of other questions that we should be asking right now, which is, well, first of all, she's a minister of the Crown. She represents Canada. In some ways, she's an ambassador. How is it that she wasn't able to just sort of get a fast-track passport? I mean, she's part of the party that runs the federal government, and they couldn't somehow expedite this or fast-track it or just get it resolved. I mean, if I was in the government, say if I was the Minister of Immigration and one of my colleagues came to me and was like, we need to fix this problem. I mean, wouldn't that be a priority for your government, especially considering the headache that this caused for Justin Trudeau and his party in Canada, just given how strange the story was, and how, I mean, Mary Monsef ended up getting demoted from her position in cabinet not too much longer. I mean, that was also partially because of her incompetence when it came to trying to bring forth electoral reform, which was a cabinet position that she held. But regardless, it's just strange that they wouldn't have been able to figure out a solution to this now over a year later. And so alongside just that basic question of, what's the holdup? Why hasn't the government been able to fix this very basic problem? Change the birthday, change the birthplace. Well, maybe it's because Monsef hasn't been able to actually verify where she was born. Maybe it's because when she went to go verify this, a whole bunch of other questions came up and we just don't know about them because there hasn't been a news story about it or hasn't become public information. We know that in order to update a passport, you need to provide a secondary piece of documentation, either a birth certificate or, if you're an immigrant, your citizenship papers. And so back in 2016, when this story was unfolding, Monsef sort of refused to say whether or not the mistake only appeared on her passport or if it was a mistake that was also repeated on her citizenship papers. Well, given the delay, I think one can assume that the problem is duplicated on her original citizenship application. And do recall that the Trudeau government routinely and regularly strips citizenship from individuals who lie on those applications. So if you lie on your citizenship application, your citizenship will be revoked. I have a clip of Justin Trudeau saying this exact thing.
Revocation of citizenship can and should happen in situations of becoming a Canadian citizen on false pretenses. Indeed, when people have lied as on their applications, those applications get rescinded even years later.
So even Trudeau himself says that citizenship can and should be rescinded in situations where someone becomes a citizen under false pretenses. That's exactly what's happened. It appears that's exactly what's happened with Monsef, and yet, there's a double standard here because that's not going to obviously apply to Mary and Monsef. So I think that that's just sort of the first question. Then there's another line of questioning that really is, if Mary Monsef has this fake passport or this passport that has erroneous information in it, how has she been able to travel? Has she left Canada in the last 14 months? If so, did she use a passport that contained false information? Did she knowingly use a false passport to travel internationally? Well, media put that question to Monsef's office and they just flat out refused to answer. They flat out refused to answer. So draw your own conclusions from their refusal to answer those sorts of basic questions. But I think it really does go back to show the sort of issues that were there all along. A year ago, when I was digging into this, I felt like I was one of the only journalists in Canada that was really digging, and it was surprising because Canadians cared a lot about this issue. Every time I would write a story about this, it would end up, being the top shared story on my news website. It would be sort of a big breaking news thing. Canadians were deeply interested in this case because there's just so many interesting elements of it, and yet so many members of the media, they not only sort of refused to say that this was an important story, or they refused to investigate. They actually sort of started turning on me and questioning why I was still writing about Monsef, because they didn't think it was newsworthy anymore. Well, clearly it was still newsworthy because Canadians want to know. Canadians want to know more of the story, and they wanted some of these questions answered. The questions that Monsef's office was just flat out refusing to answer, and they're still flat out refusing to answer some pretty basic questions. Have you traveled in the last 14 months? If so, what passport did you use? I mean, those are pretty straightforward questions. Everyone should be able to answer them right away. It shouldn't be something that you have to stonewall and deny, and every time that they do that, they just sort of look worse and worse. And I think, again, that probably the major reason why Canadians were so interested and so many Canadians were so upset over this story, there definitely was an element of that double standard that I was talking about when it came to citizenship revocation. But another issue is just sort of like, let's look at the basic elements of our refugee determination system. So here is a family that came from Iran, told us that they came from Afghanistan, and were able to get refugee status that way. I mean, it shows Canada as being pretty gullible. We just sort of accept the story of whoever comes in front of us. I know the process, and there is a citizenship judge that's assigned to each case, but there's only so far that they can go to actually be able to verify information, which is part of the problem. A lot of refugees, a lot of asylum seekers show up to Canada. They've been coached, they've been told what to say, they know what things that they should say in order to have a higher likelihood of gaining refugee status. And there's certainly a lot at stake if you can manage to cheat your way into Canada, and now under Liberal Prime Minister Justin Trudeau, who's eliminating the whole process of stripping citizenship and citizenship revocation. Well, there's no punishment. There's no downside. Even if you get caught lying, you still get to keep your Canadian citizenship. So who cares, right? It shows a total gullibleness when it comes to our refugee system. And then even further along, you have this woman who ran for political office in Canada. She was elected as a Liberal MP. She was promoted into Justin Trudeau's colorful rainbow cabinet. She fit the demographic that they wanted, which was a former Afghan refugee cabinet minister. What about the screening and vetting in order to get top secret security clearance? No one looked into her birth certificate, or no one was able to figure out exactly where it was that she was born and raised. I mean, it took investigative journalists working on tips for this story to finally come out, which means that Canadian journalists who have no resources, who are just digging and talking to people and reading, were able to find out more about the history and the life story of a Canadian cabinet minister than our own intelligence services, than our own policing services, than the people who are assigned to screen and vet not only refugees when they come into the country, but also people who are obtaining the highest positions in our federal government and are given military secrets and given all kinds of other information that is only privy to those who obtain this top secret status. So I think that it's troubling for people who are watching and paying attention to know that really there's a lot of holes in these systems. And I mean, I believe that Maryam Monsef, I don't think she's a spy. I don't think that she's working on behalf of another government or working covertly as sort of a mole within the Canadian government. If she was, and she did a pretty awful job about it, I don't think that's the case here. After doing an investigation and sort of looking into it at depth, but it does expose. The whole story does show how Canada is exposed to someone who might actually be a subversive agent from another regime or an enemy regime looking to plant themselves into our government. It shows how we are vulnerable to that kind of a threat, and hopefully it should be a wake-up call to the Canadian government that really we need to up our game when it comes to protecting ourselves from potential threats. So that's where I'm going to leave it at today. Thank you so much for tuning in to this podcast. Don't forget to subscribe. And if you visit my website, which is thetruenorthinitiative.com, you can sign up for a weekly newsletter that I send out with all of the top stories of the week focused on immigration, security, free speech issues, all the things that you need to know that's going on. And I also include my own columns and my podcasts and the other work that I do. So thank you so much for tuning in.